On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson sat at a desk in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by civil rights leaders, members of Congress, and a host of dignitaries. With more than 70 pens laid out before him, Johnson signed his name on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history. The signing marked the culmination of a decades-long struggle against racial segregation and discrimination, and it symbolized a pivotal command decision by a president who risked his political future to move the nation closer to its founding ideals of equality and justice. Johnson's decision to push for and ultimately sign the Civil Rights Act was not inevitable. It was the product of political calculation, personal conviction, and moral leadership exercised at a moment when America stood at a dangerous crossroads. The early 1960s were years of intense racial tension. The civil rights movement had grown from local protests into a national force. Activists such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Medgar Evers, alongside countless unnamed organizers, were confronting segregation in schools, restaurants, buses, and voting booths across the South. The images of peaceful demonstrators being beaten, hosed, and jailed were broadcast nationwide, shocking the conscience of many Americans. Yet Congress remained paralyzed. Southern lawmakers, wielding the power of the filibuster, had for decades blocked any serious civil rights reform. President John F. Kennedy, though sympathetic, had hesitated to press aggressively for legislation, fearing a backlash that could jeopardize his broader political agenda. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, the future of civil rights legislation seemed uncertain. Into this moment of grief and instability stepped Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president and a Southerner from Texas. Many civil rights leaders viewed Johnson with suspicion. He had once opposed civil rights measures and was deeply tied to the Southern political establishment. Yet Johnson's experience as Senate Majority Leader had given him an unparalleled understanding of how to navigate Congress. More importantly, Kennedy's death presented him with both a challenge and an opportunity to honor his predecessor's legacy by achieving what Kennedy could not. In his first address to Congress as president, Johnson declared, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long." These words signaled a dramatic shift. Johnson was throwing the full weight of his presidency behind civil rights reform. The decision was far from politically safe. The Democratic Party in 1964 was a fragile coalition of Northern liberals and Southern segregationists. Johnson knew that pushing through civil rights legislation would alienate much of the South, the very region that had formed the party's foundation for nearly a century. Privately, he is said to have remarked, "We have lost the South for a generation." Yet Johnson's understanding of leadership went beyond political arithmetic. He believed that a president must act decisively when moral imperatives aligned with the nation's long-term interests. Having grown up in the poverty-stricken Texas Hill Country, Johnson had seen inequality firsthand. His experiences as a teacher in a Mexican-American school deepened his empathy for the marginalized. These personal convictions, combined with his legislative skill, made him uniquely capable of translating moral urgency into political action. The battle for the Civil Rights Act was one of the fiercest legislative fights in American history. Southern senators launched a filibuster that lasted for 60 working days, the longest in Senate history at that point. Johnson worked tirelessly behind the scenes, leveraging his relationships, offering political favors, and applying relentless pressure. He enlisted Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, a Republican from Illinois, as a crucial ally. Johnson knew that only a bipartisan coalition could break the Southern blockade. Through persuasion and compromise, Dirksen helped bring enough Republicans on board to achieve cloture, ending the filibuster on June 10, 1964. The Senate then passed the bill by a vote of 73 to 27, and the House soon followed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was sweeping in scope. It outlawed segregation in public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. It banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It authorized the federal government to enforce school desegregation and established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to investigate complaints of discrimination. In essence, the act gave the federal government unprecedented authority to intervene in areas where states had historically upheld racial inequality. It was not a complete solution. Racial prejudice and systemic discrimination persisted, but it represented a legal and moral turning point. When Johnson signed the act into law, he did so with deliberate symbolism. Using multiple pens, He handed each one to individuals who had contributed to the struggle, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and legislators who had fought for the bill in Congress. The moment was both ceremonial and deeply personal. Johnson later reflected that he felt a sense of both triumph and foreboding. He knew the law would unleash new political and social tensions, particularly in the South, where many white voters felt betrayed. Yet he also recognized that leadership sometimes requires sacrificing personal or partisan advantage for the greater good. "We must not let our grievances blind us to the truth," he said during the signing ceremony. "We must not let our differences destroy our common faith in one another." The immediate effects of the Civil Rights Act were profound. Within months, federal authorities began enforcing desegregation orders across the South. African Americans gained access to public facilities from which they had long been excluded. Businesses that refused compliance faced lawsuits and loss of federal funding. The act also inspired further reform. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which Johnson would champion the following year, built directly upon the legal and moral foundation established in 1964. Together, these laws dismantled the formal structures of Jim Crow and redefined the relationship between the federal government and its citizens. Politically, the consequences were equally dramatic. Many white Southerners abandoned the Democratic Party, accelerating a realignment that would reshape American politics for decades. Republicans began to make major gains in the South, while the Democratic Party increasingly became identified with civil rights, social justice, and federal activism. Johnson's prediction that he had lost the South proved largely accurate, but his actions also secured his place among the most consequential presidents in American history. The signing of the Civil Rights Act stands as a defining command decision, a moment when a president's courage, skill, and conviction converged to alter the nation's course. Johnson's choice to press forward despite immense opposition reflected a profound understanding of both history and humanity. He recognized that moral leadership often demands risk and that the presidency, at its best, is an instrument not merely of governance but of justice. More than 6 decades later, the Civil Rights Act remains a cornerstone of American democracy and a testament to what can be achieved when principle triumphs over politics. In the words Johnson spoke that day, its purpose is not to divide, but to end division. With that stroke of his pen, the nation took one of its most significant steps toward fulfilling its promise of liberty and equality for all. By the summer of 1964, America stood divided. The civil rights movement had brought the issue of racial justice to the forefront of national consciousness, but resistance was fierce, especially in the segregated South. Marches, sit-ins, and protests filled television screens, exposing the brutality of racial discrimination to the world. Yet, despite growing public awareness, Congress had repeatedly failed to pass meaningful legislation. President John F. Kennedy's civil rights proposal, introduced in 1963, had stalled in Congress, obstructed by a determined bloc of Southern senators. When Kennedy was assassinated in November of that year, many feared that his dream of a comprehensive civil rights law had died with him. Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, suddenly found himself thrust into the presidency amid national mourning. A Southerner from Texas, Johnson faced skepticism from both civil rights leaders and liberal Democrats. His earlier record on civil rights was mixed, and many wondered whether he would risk his political capital to champion such a controversial cause. Yet Johnson saw Kennedy's death not only as a tragedy but as a call to action. In his first address to Congress, he declared that the best way to honor Kennedy's memory was to pass the civil rights bill he had proposed. No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the civil rights bill for which he fought so long, Johnson proclaimed. This was the beginning of one of the most consequential command decisions in presidential history. Johnson understood that the bill's passage would fracture the Democratic Party's long-standing alliance with the segregationist South. Privately, he confided to an aide, "If we pass this bill, we will lose the South for a generation." But for Johnson, the issue transcended political calculation. Growing up in poverty in rural Texas, he had witnessed racial and economic inequality firsthand. His time as a young teacher in a Mexican-American school had left an indelible mark, shaping his belief that government had a responsibility to protect the dignity of every citizen. The presidency, he believed, was not a platform for popularity, it was a position of moral obligation. Determined to see the bill passed, Johnson deployed his legendary political skills, honed during his years as Senate Majority Leader. He knew every lever of congressional power, every weakness, every ego. He flattered, persuaded, and pressured lawmakers relentlessly, using what came to be known as the Johnson treatment, a mix of charm, intimidation, and persistence. "I'm going to use every ounce of strength I have to get this bill passed," he vowed. Meanwhile, civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference continued to rally public support. Images of peaceful protesters being beaten in Birmingham and harassed in Mississippi further convinced Americans that legislative action was morally necessary. Still, the Southern Democrats were determined to block the bill through a filibuster, the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. As the debate stretched into its third month, the fate of civil rights, and the moral credibility of the nation, hung in the balance. Part 2, The Decision and Its Consequences. The breakthrough came in June 1964, after the longest filibuster in Senate history, 60 working days of obstruction led by segregationists such as Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. Johnson, understanding the political mathematics better than anyone, realized that the key to victory lay not only with his fellow Democrats but with moderate Republicans. He reached out to Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois, appealing to his sense of history and conscience. "You've got to come with me," Johnson urged. "This is the time. History will never forgive us if we fail." Dirksen agreed to help, persuading enough Republicans to vote for cloture, the motion to end debate and force a vote. On June 10, the Senate voted 71 to 29 to end the filibuster, and the Civil Rights Act passed soon after by a margin of 73 to 27. The House quickly approved the revised bill, and Johnson prepared for one of the most symbolic acts of his presidency. On July 2, 1964, before a crowd of civil rights leaders, lawmakers, and dignitaries gathered in the White House East Room, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Using more than 70 ceremonial pens, he affixed his signature and handed several pens to those who had fought alongside him, including Drive. Martin Luther King Jr., who stood nearby, his face solemn yet triumphant. The moment was steeped in history and symbolism, a Southern president signing a law that dismantled much of the legal framework of segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was sweeping in scope. It outlawed segregation in public places, restaurants, theaters, hotels, and schools. It prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also strengthened federal enforcement powers, marking a profound shift in the relationship between Washington and the states. No longer could local governments legally deny African Americans equal access to public life. For millions who had lived under the shadow of Jim Crow, the law represented a long-delayed recognition of their humanity. Yet Johnson knew that progress came with political cost. In the immediate aftermath, many white Southerners felt betrayed, and conservative Democrats began drifting toward the Republican Party. The 1964 presidential election reflected this shift. Johnson won in a landslide, but the Deep South, once the bedrock of Democratic power, began its decades-long realignment toward the GOP. "We have lost the South for a generation," Johnson reportedly said that night. His prediction proved prescient: the political map of America would never be the same. Despite the backlash, the signing of the Civil Rights Act cemented Johnson's reputation as one of the most effective and consequential presidents in U.S. history. His leadership combined pragmatic politics with moral vision, proving that the presidency could be a vehicle for justice. The law also paved the way for future reforms, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which expanded democracy by protecting African Americans' right to vote. Together, these measures transformed American society and reshaped the meaning of citizenship. Johnson's decision to sign the Civil Rights Act was not an act of convenience, it was an act of conscience. It required courage to confront the entrenched systems of inequality that had defined the nation for centuries. His command decision reflected a profound understanding that leadership sometimes demands the sacrifice of political comfort for moral clarity. As Johnson declared during the signing ceremony, its purpose is not to divide, but to end division. More than 60 years later, the Civil Rights Act remains one of the most important laws ever enacted in the United States. It stands as a testament to the power of presidential resolve in moments of crisis, and as a reminder that true leadership is measured not by popularity, but by the courage to do what is right when the stakes are highest.